What if the most famous photograph ever taken of a human being wasn't a moment of spontaneous joy, but an act of calculated public humiliation? That single, iconic image, Marilyn Monroe, bathed in the glow of 1,000 flashbulbs, her white dress billowing over a New York subway grate, has been sold for decades as a symbol of uninhibited, feminine bliss. But that is a lie. It was a meticulously staged execution of a woman's spirit, orchestrated by the very men who claimed to have created her. And as the ravenous crowds cheered that night, they were applauding a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The illusion was perfect. The cost was incalculable. Before Marilyn, there was only Norma Jean Doherty, a girl born from the fractured bedrock of Los Angeles, a ghost haunting the corridors of orphanages and foster homes. She was a canvas of untapped ambition and profound insecurity, a combination that proved irresistible to the predators of Hollywood. The men who ran the studios in the 1940s weren't filmmakers. They were industrialists. They didn't build stars. They forged products. And in Norma Jean, they saw the raw material for their greatest creation. The first architect was Johnny Hyde, a titan in the William Morris Agency, a man whose small stature was eclipsed by a shadow that stretched across the entire studio system. He saw her, not as a woman, but as a project, his final, desperate masterpiece before his own heart gave out. It was Hyde who chiseled at the foundation, demanding the platinum hair, the surgically refined nose, the slight lisp that would become a global signature of breathless desire. He taught her how to walk, how to talk, how to sign her name, not as a person, but as a brand. Norma Jean was being systematically erased. He secured her a 7-year contract with 20th Century Fox, a document that was less an employment agreement and more a bill of sale. Studio chief Darryl F. Zaranuk became the new owner. Fox wasn't just buying her time. They were buying her identity. They dictated her friendships, her romances, her political opinions. Her weight was monitored weekly, her diet prescribed, her every public appearance scripted down to the last nervous giggle. She was a prisoner in a couture gown, living in a gilded cage where the bars were made of flashbulbs and newsprint. This brings us to the first rehook. The illusion of control required a constant, public performance. And in 1954, the studio needed its biggest performance yet. Marilyn had just married Joe DiMaggio, the stoic, intensely private baseball hero. He was a man of tradition, a man who believed a wife's place was in the home, not splashed across the tabloids. The studio saw this marriage not as a union, but as a threat, a complication. DiMaggio wanted to possess Norma Jean. The studio needed to remind him, and the world, that they owned Marilyn Monroe. The subway grate scene for the 7-year itch was their weapon of choice. It was planned with military precision. Director Billy Wilder may have been behind the camera, but the studio's publicity department were the true generals of this operation. They tipped off every major newspaper and wire service in New York City, ensuring a circus. They didn't just invite the press. They cultivated a mob, promising them a spectacle of flesh and fantasy under the gritty city lights. It was scheduled for 1 a.m. on September 15, 1954, a time chosen to maximize the drama, the sordidness, the feeling that the city was witnessing something it shouldn't be. Thousands of onlookers, mostly men, pushed against police barricades, their faces hungry and anonymous in the dark. They screamed her name, their calls echoing off the brick and steel canyons of Manhattan. The air was electric, with a predatory energy, and Marilyn, playing her part, smiled and waved. But the script she'd been given was a lie. The studio had told her it would be a quick, controlled shoot with a few dozen professional photographers. They never told her they were feeding her to the wolves, and they certainly didn't tell her about the guest of honor. Standing in the shadows, just beyond the Klieg lights, was Joe DiMaggio. He hadn't come by chance. He was there by a specific, calculated invitation from the studio's head of publicity, a man named Harry Brand. It was a power play, a deliberate act of provocation. Brand wanted DiMaggio to see, with his own 2 eyes, the woman he thought he had married being transformed back into the property he could never own. He was there to witness her humiliation. Take after take, the wind from the subway simulator roared. The white dress billowed higher and higher. The crowd surged, their shouts turning into a collective, guttural roar. Photographers scrambled, climbing on top of cars, jostling for the perfect shot, the one that would expose the most. It was no longer a movie scene. It was a public dissection. Marilyn's playful shrieks began to sound strained, her smile a rictus of sheer panic. She was performing desire, but her eyes were screaming for help, and her husband just watched, his rage hardening into something terrible. The performance ended just before 3 in the morning. The cheers of the crowd were still ringing in her ears as she was whisked back to the St. Regis Hotel. The moment the suite door closed, the illusion shattered. The sounds that came from that room, as reported by journalists on the same floor, were not of a Hollywood argument. They were the sounds of violence. DiMaggio, a man whose public image was built on quiet dignity, erupted. His silent fury had found its voice, and it was brutal. The most celebrated cinematic moment of her career ended in a physical assault. The next morning, the architects went into damage control. But not for Marilyn. They were protecting the asset. Studio fixers were dispatched. The hotel staff was paid for their silence. Stories were planted with friendly columnists, blaming the incident on exhaustion and the pressures of fame. The narrative had to be controlled. The public could see the fantasy on screen, but they could never know the price she paid for it in private. 2 weeks later, bruised and heartbroken, Marilyn Monroe filed for divorce. The studio had won. They had severed the tie to her private life. She was theirs again, completely. This is the second rehook. The architects of her reality weren't just the men in the boardrooms. They had partners, soldiers, on the front lines of public opinion. The gossip columnists, men like Walter Winchell and Hedda Hopper, were the unofficial propaganda wing of the studio system. They wielded their columns like cudgels, capable of creating a star overnight or destroying a career with a single, well-placed sentence. They operated on a currency of leaks, whispers, and threats, and the studios fed them a steady diet of curated reality. Memos from the Fox publicity department reveal a sophisticated, insidious strategy. When Marilyn was cooperative, the columns would be filled with stories of her charm, her professionalism, her love for her fans. These were often fabricated anecdotes, written by publicists and handed directly to Winchell's assistants. But when she pushed back, demanding a better script, more pay, or a day off, the tone would shift overnight. Anonymous sources would suddenly appear, whispering to the tabloids about her being difficult, unprofessional, mentally unstable. They weren't reporting the news. They were manufacturing consent for her subjugation. It was a perfect system of control. Her every act of rebellion was reframed as an act of madness. Her legitimate frustrations with being typecast as a dumb blonde were spun as the ungrateful tantrums of a star who didn't appreciate her good fortune. She was trapped in a feedback loop of their creation. The more she fought to be seen as a serious artist, as Norma Jean, the more the machine painted her as the hysterical, unreliable Marilyn. She was fighting an enemy who wrote the history of the war as it was happening. This psychological warfare reached its apex in 1961. After the collapse of her marriage to Arthur Miller and the grueling production of The Misfits, Marilyn was emotionally and physically depleted. She sought help, voluntarily checking into a New York hospital for rest. She believed she was going to a private, therapeutic facility. But one of her doctors, in a decision shrouded in mystery and suspicion, had her committed instead to the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic, the lockdown ward. She walked into a hospital. She woke up in a prison. The architects had found their ultimate weapon. For 72 hours, she was held in a padded cell, with no clothes, no rights, and no contact with the outside world. The woman who could captivate millions with a single glance was now patient number 60247. Her pleas for help were dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed mind. Her identity had been so completely overwritten by the studio's fiction that when she tried to tell the staff who she was, they didn't believe her. They told her that Marilyn Monroe was just a fantasy. This is the third rehook. Who made that call? The official story is that her psychiatrist, Drive, Marianne Criss, felt it was necessary. But Criss was deeply connected to the Freudian psychoanalytic elite, a circle that included Marilyn's controversial Los Angeles therapist, Drive, Ralph Greenson. Greenson was more than just a doctor to Marilyn. In her final years, he was a gatekeeper. He advised her on contracts, vetted her friends, and administered a daily cocktail of potent narcotics. He was an architect of her mind, but newly uncovered correspondence suggests he wasn't working alone. Dr. Greenson was in regular, confidential communication with the board of 20th Century Fox. While he claimed his only concern was his patient's well-being, his letters to the studio focused heavily on her filming schedule, her malleability to direction, and methods for ensuring her compliance on set. He was, in effect, providing the studio with a user's manual for their most valuable and most volatile asset. He was teaching them how to pull her psychological strings. Her therapy wasn't a refuge, it was a laboratory. This revelation reframes everything. The decision to commit her wasn't just a medical choice. It was a strategic one. It was a message, a demonstration of ultimate power. It was the architects reminding their creation that they could not only control her image, her money, and her career, they could control her sanity. They could have her legally declared incompetent. They could erase her, for real this time, and lock Norma Jean away forever. She was saved only by the one man the studio couldn't control. Joe DiMaggio. Alerted by a desperate, smuggled letter, he flew from Florida to New York and, in a display of quiet, menacing power, threatened to tear the hospital down brick by brick if they didn't release her. They released her, but the paranoia, the feeling of being constantly watched and manipulated, never left her. It burrowed deep into her soul. She started to suspect everyone. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, was a woman hired by Dr. Greenson. Her publicist, Pat Newcomb, was a known associate of the Kennedy clan. She felt the walls closing in, the network of control tightening around her. She began sweeping her own home for listening devices, convinced that the architects were no longer content to just shape her reality from afar. Now, they were in her house. She believed they were listening to every breath, every sob, every secret. And one sweltering afternoon in July of 1962, just weeks before her death, she found something. While looking for a misplaced notebook in a guest bedroom, a room frequently used by her psychiatrist for their sessions, her hand brushed against a loose floorboard beneath the rug. Curiosity turned to cold dread as she pried it open. Inside, nestled in a small, hollowed-out space, was a compact, state-of-the-art recording device. It was still warm to the touch. The spools were still turning. The sound was almost imperceptible. A faint, hypnotic whirring. The sound of her life being stolen, second by second. This wasn't the work of a gossip columnist or a studio executive trying to manage an asset. This was professional. This was clandestine. And in that moment of sickening clarity, Marilyn understood. The architects weren't just in Hollywood. They were everywhere. This is the fourth rehook. Who was the real target of this surveillance? Was it truly her? Or was she just a conduit? A microphone with a pretty face placed in the most powerful bedrooms in America? Because in the spring of 1962, Marilyn Monroe's private life had become a matter of national security. Her affair with President John F. Kennedy was Hollywood's worst-kept secret, but her subsequent, more intense and complicated relationship with his brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was a secret almost no one knew. And it was a secret some would kill to protect. She wasn't just a mistress. To the Kennedys, she was a momentary escape, a glittering diversion from the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation. But to their enemies, she was something else entirely. She was a key, a vulnerability, a direct line into the nerve center of American power. Think about who Robert Kennedy was making enemies of. As Attorney General, he had declared a scorched earth war on organized crime, relentlessly pursuing figures like Sam Giancana and Teamsters boss Jimmy Hoffa, men who had, ironically, allegedly helped get his brother elected. At the same time, he was navigating the treacherous internal politics of Washington, often clashing with the notoriously paranoid and powerful FBI Director, J. Edgar Hoover, who kept meticulous files on the private sins of everyone in power. Marilyn was the nexus point where all these lethal forces converged. Did the mob plant the bug, hoping to catch the Kennedy brothers sharing state secrets in moments of post-coital candor? Did Hoover order it, seeking the ultimate blackmail material to keep the administration under his thumb? Or, most terrifyingly, did the Kennedys themselves plant it, to keep tabs on a woman who was becoming increasingly volatile and emotionally demanding? A woman who knew too much. The discovery of that device changed the game. The victim was now armed. The architects had overplayed their hand, and in doing so, they showed her the true value of what she knew. She wasn't just a movie star anymore. She was an intelligence asset, and she began to act like one. She had started keeping a diary, her infamous Little Red Diary. It wasn't just a record of her feelings. It was a ledger. She documented everything. The dates and times of RFK's visits, his private thoughts on the Cuban Missile Crisis, his fears about the mafia's reach, his candid, unguarded opinions on J. Edgar Hoover, pillow talk that could be construed as treason. The diary was her life insurance. The tapes were the corroborating evidence. Her behavior in her final weeks was not the spiraling of a depressed woman. It was the calculated maneuvering of a cornered player looking for an exit. She began reaching out, testing the waters, letting people know she had leverage. She told her friend, the journalist Robert Slatzer, that she had information that would shock the world. She told her masseur, Ralph Roberts, about the diary, even reading him passages over the phone. She was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, creating witnesses. She was preparing to go public. Her final move was her boldest. On August 3, 1962, just one day before her death, she allegedly placed a call to the main switchboard of the Department of Justice, demanding to speak to Robert Kennedy. The operator, following protocol for a call to the Attorney General, would have logged it. That log, along with all of Marilyn's personal phone records for the months of July and August 1962, vanished. They were seized, classified, and have never been seen since. Who has the power to make the phone records of a private citizen disappear? Not a studio, not even the mob. That level of erasure requires the full weight of the state. The architects were no longer just shaping her reality. They were erasing it from history. The official story of what happened next is a masterclass in narrative control. A story of depression, addiction, and accidental overdose. A sad but simple end for a troubled star. It was clean, it was digestible, and it was almost certainly a lie. The story was manufactured before her body was even cold. The man who performed her autopsy, Thomas Noguchi, was a rookie deputy medical examiner at the time. Yet even he was baffled by what he found. Or rather, what he didn't find. Marilyn had supposedly swallowed 40 to 50 Nembutal capsules, but Noguchi found no trace of the pills in her stomach. No yellow dye from the gelatin capsules. Nothing. It was as if the drugs had materialized directly into her bloodstream. This is physiologically impossible through oral ingestion. The only other explanation is that she was given the fatal dose via an injection. Noguchi searched her body meticulously for a needle mark, but found none. He was about to order microscopic analysis of her organs, a step that would have definitively proven how the drugs entered her system, when he received a direct order to release the body for burial immediately. The investigation was over. Who gives an order like that? Who halts a murder investigation before it can even begin? The inconsistencies piled up. The housekeeper, Eunice Murray, gave at least 3 different versions of the night's timeline to police. First, she said she discovered the body around 3 a.m. Then, she changed her story to midnight. She also claimed to have called Drive Greenson first, who then arrived and called the police. But phone records that escaped the purge show that the first call to the police wasn't made until 4:25 a.m. What happened in those missing hours? Why the changing stories? Why the delay? The house was reportedly being cleaned, the laundry was running, and a key witness, Marilyn's publicist, Pat Newcomb, was sedated and flown out of town on a private jet before she could be properly questioned. This wasn't the scene of a suicide. It was the scene of a cleanup operation. And then there's the method itself. The architects had spent years crafting the image of Marilyn as mentally fragile, a woman perpetually on the verge of a breakdown. A suicidal Marilyn was the perfect final chapter to the fiction they had written. It was plausible. It was tragic. It was, above all, convenient. It closed the book on any inconvenient questions she might have started asking. It silenced the one voice that knew their secrets. But there's one more piece to this puzzle. A piece that suggests the cleanup wasn't as clean as they had hoped. The first police officer on the scene was a man named Jack Clemens. He arrived to find Drive Greenson and the housekeeper behaving strangely, as if they were performing a pre-rehearsed script. Clemens noted in his report that Marilyn's body appeared to have been moved. The state of rigor mortis was inconsistent with the position in which she was found. He saw no water glass by the bed, nothing for her to have washed down 50 pills with. He saw a scene that felt wrong, staged, and he saw something else. On the floor, tucked partially under the bed, was her little red diary. Clemens saw the diary. He understood its potential importance. But when he reached for it, he was stopped by a senior officer who arrived moments later. The diary was taken, logged as evidence, and then, like the phone records, it simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. It was scrubbed from the record, or so they thought. Decades later, a retired high-ranking official from the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office would claim, off the record, that the diary was not destroyed. It was, he alleged, locked away in a secure vault, a piece of political dynamite too dangerous to release and too valuable to destroy. What was in it? What secrets did Norma Jean write down in her final, desperate days? The official story requires us to believe it was filled with nothing more than the sad ramblings of a fading star. But the architect's actions tell a different story. You don't mobilize the highest levels of power to cover up a simple suicide. You don't orchestrate a multi-agency operation to erase the final hours of a depressed actress. You do it to protect a president. You do it to neutralize a threat. You do it to hide a murder. The woman they had created, the fantasy named Marilyn Monroe, had finally learned the truth of her existence. She was never a person. She was a product. And when the product became defective, when it threatened to reveal the secrets of its manufacturers, it was recalled. Permanently. Permanently. But what if the architects of her demise weren't just in the White House? What if the official story, and even the most popular conspiracy theories, are still just a cover for an even darker truth? We've been trained to see this as a tragic political love triangle. Marilyn, Jack, and Bobby. But what if there was a fourth, silent partner in this lethal relationship? That partner was the mob. Through her long-standing connections with figures like Frank Sinatra, Marilyn wasn't just adjacent to power. She was embedded in the criminal underworld that helped put that power in place. She knew things that went far beyond whispered confessions of extramarital affairs. She knew about the unholy alliance between the Kennedy political machine and organized crime. Suddenly, the stakes become infinitely higher. This wasn't just about protecting a family's reputation. This was about national security. Marilyn reportedly knew about the mafia's role in rigging the 1960 election. She knew about the clandestine CIA plots, which used mob hitmen in their attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro. Her little red diary wasn't just a log of broken hearts. It was a potential ledger of treason. A jilted lover talking to the press is a scandal. But a woman who could connect the President of the United States directly to the head of the Chicago outfit wasn't just a scandal. She was a threat that could dismantle the entire government. From this perspective, her death wasn't just a cleanup. It was a professional hit, executed with the cold precision of an organization that specialized in silencing witnesses. Was the order given by Bobby Kennedy, not as a panicked brother, but as the Attorney General using a deniable asset? A simple phone call to a mutual friend. A problem that needed to disappear. And for the mob, there's only one permanent solution for a problem like that. The method, in the end, was brutally simple. A needle, not 50 pills swallowed in a fit of despair, but a single, fatal injection. A hotshot, administered with clinical efficiency, leaving behind minimal traces, and a perfectly plausible cover story. Who held the syringe? Dr. Greenson? Acting under orders? A mob enforcer? Sent to do what they do best? We will never truly know. The architects were professionals. They left behind a ghost story, a puzzle with 100 pieces, 99 of which are designed to distract you from the one that matters, the truth. In death, the product they created became more powerful than ever. The tragedy of her final act was the ultimate marketing tool. It sealed her image in time, forever young, beautiful, and broken. The story of Marilyn Monroe, the fragile star who burned too brightly, was no longer just a Hollywood fiction, but was a national myth, a cautionary tale written in the neat, clean handwriting of her murderers. The final scene they staged in her Brentwood bedroom was her greatest and most successful performance. But beneath the myth, buried under decades of lies, is the woman they truly killed. Not the icon, not the sex symbol, but Norma Jean, a fiercely intelligent, ambitious woman who fought her entire life to be taken seriously, only to learn that her value was in her silence. She was the inconvenient truth at the heart of the American dream, a dream that, for her, became a waking nightmare. She didn't want to die, she wanted to be heard. The ghost of Norma Jean still haunts the corridors of power. Her story is more than a celebrity tragedy. It's a chilling exposé of how fame, politics, and organized crime can converge to create a monster that consumes everything it touches. The bright, shining myth of Camelot has a dark basement. And in that basement is the truth of what happened on the night of August 4th, 1962. The truth is that Marilyn Monroe wasn't a casualty of fame. She was a casualty of power. The truth, like her little red diary, remains under lock and key. But the questions endure. And by asking them, we refuse to let the architects have the final word. We demand to know the story of the woman they tried to erase. The boulevards of power are filled with forgotten stories and silenced voices. To uncover more of the truth hidden in the shadows, subscribe to Boulevard_of_Monroe.